The roads and boardwalks are deserted. The doors sway in the wind. There are no children laughing and adults gossiping. The gold rush is long over. It is but a memory left in the old dusty journals. With nightfall, the spirits return to tell their tales. That's a quote from Sue Kaiser, and you can find it printed on the informational booklet they give you when you visit Bannack State Park in southwestern Montana. I was just there, and originally Bannack State Park was not on my list of places to visit. I had never even heard of this place before I went. But when I did hear about it at the Big Hole National Battlefield, the idea of an entire ghost town protected as a state park stuck in my mind. Of course, I've heard of and visited ghost towns before, and many parks contain the abandoned remnants of their once lively past. But there was something about Bannack that just wormed its way into my brain. This idea of a ghost town as a state park. Something beckoned me to visit, so that's exactly what I did. I went to the Bannack State Park ghost town to learn its story. And now I'm sharing it with you. So the first thing you need to know about the town of Bannack is that it was a gold rush town. The very first place anywhere in Montana where gold was discovered, way back in 1862. Along comes this guy by the name of John White, who, along with a group from Colorado, discovers gold along the banks of what he called Grasshopper Creek because it had a lot of grasshoppers around it. Actually, though, this creek technically already had a name. It was named by Lewis and Clark as Willard's Creek, but White didn't know that, and so he just kind of got to name it whatever he wanted, and that's how it got the name Grasshopper Creek, despite its incredible originality. Anyway, so they find gold, and if you find gold at this point in history, things just kick off. Gold was going for like $18 an ounce at this time, which is like over $500 today, and people start flooding into this little creek in the mountains of southwest Montana. And pretty soon, they've got themselves a little settlement, the town of Bannack, which is probably named for the Bannack indigenous peoples who call this area home. After that first season, by the end of 1862, you've got like 400 people in town and would have over 3,000 by the following spring. By the end of that first year, they had pulled more than $500,000 worth of gold out of the mountains. It became the capital of the newly established Montana Territory. The first governor's mansion still stands there today. In 1863, they got a post office. They built the second ever brick courthouse in Montana for Beaverhead County in 1875 for a whopping $14,000, even though it would only remain the county seat for the next 6 years. This whole operation at Bannack was a thriving community built off the bounty of the land. It was built off of gold. And even though gold was the main economic driver for this little town of Bannack, a community like this needed other things as well. You can't just survive on gold and gold miners. They needed shops and saloons and doctors and lawyers, and you could argue whether or not they were necessary, but they did have houses of prostitution as well. Craftspeople and tradesmen were needed, tailors and wheelwrights and carpenters. A church was built in 1877, the only one the town ever had. I read an account of one woman who was afraid of the quote-unquote state of religion on the frontier, and so she carried around a signed letter from her minister back home announcing her to be in good standing with the church and that she should be accepted into, quote, any church of Christ, wherever her lot may be cast, end quote. In 1874, they built a school, which actually doubled as a Masonic lodge. Initially, also, they didn't have any jails here because they didn't want to bother with guarding prisoners where they could be working on their mining claims, but they did eventually build one of those as well in 1863. As far as leisure activities, they hosted balls and dances, traveling theater troupes and circuses came to town. There were spelling bees, they went picnicking, rode horses, and fished. In the winter, they would ice skate and sled. They even had a bowling alley and a baseball team, which competed against other teams from nearby rural communities like Red Rock, Argenta, and Mill Point. But this was the frontier, remember. Life was not easy. Rather the opposite, actually. It was harsh and unforgiving and really challenging at times. Also, things were just a lot more expensive here because of how isolated it was. There weren't a lot of supplies and access to Bannack was pretty difficult, so there was a premium on things as simple as flour or sugar. They also had this thing called a miner's court. So basically, because Montana was so new, it really didn't have a government yet, or a lot of government, and there was no way to regulate or oversee mining claims. So the miners just kind of did it themselves. They had a judge and a sheriff, and you'd go out and stake your claim along the creek with literal stakes 100 feet up or down the banks. Then you'd go and record your claim with the recorder, and you've got yourself a mining claim. You had to work it at least 5 days a week, or else your claim was forfeited and could be quote-unquote jumped, but exceptions were made for people who were sick. One resident, Granville Stewart, claimed that, quote, "the laws laid down by the miners' court were very simple and absolutely just," end quote. And yeah, because this was the Wild West, they had their fair share of outlaws as well. Mrs. Emily Meredith was quoted in 1863 as saying, quote, "I don't know how many deaths have occurred this winter, but that there have not been twice as many is entirely owing to the fact that drunken men do not shoot well. There are times when it is really unsafe to go through the main street. The bullets whiz around so, and no one thinks of punishing a man for shooting another," end quote. Thomas Dimsdale also had this to say, quote, "It is probable that there never was a mining town of the same size that contained more desperadoes or lawless characters than Bannack during the winter of 1862-63, end quote. There was even an elected sheriff, Henry Plummer, who was a convicted felon and who was suspected to have been the leader of his own outlaw gang. So, the guy who is elected to uphold the law was out there holding people up on the highways instead. There is some debate today about whether or not he was actually involved, and some historians do doubt the veracity of these claims and the evidence presented, but nonetheless, this gang, which dubbed themselves the Innocents, robbed countless people and murdered more than 100. Eventually, people just kind of got fed up with this and took it upon themselves to do the whole vigilante justice thing. They would go on to execute 20 of these innocents, including Sheriff Plummer and 2 of his deputies, and banish more from the area under the threat of death. Fun fact, Nathaniel Langford, the first superintendent of Yellowstone National Park, was one of these vigilantes. Now, so far, I've painted a picture of this very prosperous, stereotypical Wild West mining boomtown. But that's exactly what it was, a boomtown. As soon as there was no boom to the town, as soon as all the easily accessible gold was removed, the heydays of Bannack were over. The county seat had already been moved to Dillon back in 1881, and despite new mining technologies creating a couple of smaller booms throughout the years, Bannack was a ghost town by the 1940s. But that doesn't mean its story was over. Far from it. I mean, I'm making this video because Bannack became a protected place, which is kind of like my whole shtick in case you didn't notice. But yeah, by the 1940s, advocates were already calling for Bannack's preservation. These included the Beaverhead County Museum Association, Southwestern Montana Mining Association, and the Daughters of the American Revolution. In 1947, a group from the Western Montana College began preservation efforts on some of the buildings, and throughout the late 40s and 50s, citizen groups began buying up a lot of the land in and around Bannack. On January 23, 1954, the Beaverhead County Museum Association formally donated the property to the state of Montana as a state park. On the stipulation, however, that it could not be used as a tourist town. The ghost town atmosphere, the abandoned nature of the site had to be maintained and preserved. It was required to exist as it was so that future generations could see it as history remembers it. The Montana State Park Service uses the phrase preserved rather than restored, protected rather than exploited, which I really like. And so that's the story of Bannack. I think the reason it appealed to me so much, why I wanted to visit and tell its story, is because it's a living laboratory, a living piece of history. Recently, I've found myself drawn more and more to these types of places, just like I was to the Grant Coors Ranch, because they're places frozen in time. Places we can go and visit and learn and immerse ourselves in the experiences of the past, to find out what life was like in far-off places all those years ago. It's not a gaudy tourist attraction or some caricature of a ghost town. It is a ghost town, preserved as it was over 100 years ago. You can go inside all of the buildings as long as they're unlocked, walk through the rooms of pioneers and settlers, the halls of a hotel where weary travelers might have stayed on their way through town. You can go to the bar and the saloon and imagine getting caught in the middle of a shootout or sipping a glass of bourbon. You can visit the lone church or the lone schoolhouse. You can see the gallows where Sheriff Plummer and his deputies were hanged, the cemetery where members of this community were buried. It's all there, preserved and protected for you to visit. This idea of Bannack, a ghost town, preserved as a state park, protected and frozen in time, is, I think, best summed up in this little informational pamphlet that I opened this video with. It says, quote, "Bannack does not belong to any one of us. We are all, in a sense, only borrowing it, and will be passing it on to the next generation. We are only caretakers with the responsibility of passing it on intact." End quote. Alrighty, Bannack State Park. I think that's my first state park that I've covered on this channel. So I'm expanding my potential story material once again, as if I didn't already have enough ideas that I already can't get through. But there are some good stories out there, and I want to talk about all sorts of protected places, all sorts of parks, and good stories take time, so I'm happy to wait until it's the right time for them to be told. If you have any story suggestions, I'd be happy to hear them down in the comments. Also, this was a field visit for me, of course. All the Bannack footage you saw in this video was shot by me on location. And I couldn't do stuff like that without the support of my patrons over at patreon.com/National Park Diaries. They quite literally make this whole operation possible, and I am very grateful to them for that. If you'd like to be a part of this operation and support what I'm trying to do here to bring stories from the world's protected places to more people, then do consider checking out my Patreon as well if you are willing and able. Lots of good perks over there for as low as $2 per month. You can also follow me on Instagram. I've got some pictures of Bannack up over there, and it's probably the best place for channel updates, or if you need to get in touch with me, it's probably the best place for that too. Okay, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.